We have a lot to recap as far as the fight game is concerned. Huge weekend. Absolutely loved it. UFC 291, back in the state of Utah, second time in 11 months, and it definitely did not disappoint. And we also had a marquee boxing match that turned out to be as lopsided as it could possibly get, as Terrence Crawford proving that he is number one pound for pound without a doubt, destroying Errol Spence. Take the under on that, 10.5. I was all about the over. It could have probably ended within 7 if Bud wanted it to. We'll talk about all that and more. Joining us over the phone right now, we have one of the finest MMA minds you will ever come across. He's also a huge Terrence Crawford fan. He was a huge Crawford fan before it was cool. He's Larry Pepe, and he's joining us over the phone right now. Larry, always a pleasure to get you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You've called this Terrence Crawford domination for about 5-6 years. Seems like every time you and I have had a conversation, be it on air or off air, you are always tooting the horn of Terrence Crawford. My God, this guy is something else, isn't he?
He really is. And you know, the best way I think I can say it, Jordan, is that Errol Spence gave Terrence Crawford the opportunity to show us how great Terrence Crawford really is. Like, whatever you thought of Bud going into that fight, and as you mentioned, I've thought a lot of him for a long time. Like I picked him, but I didn't see that coming. Like, I thought it was going to be a reasonably close fight. I just thought Bud would prevail. But that was a prolonged, sustained beating leading to a finish. And, you know, it's different if Terrence had gone in and knocked Spence out in the first round. You know, people could say, well, you know, maybe Spence had an off night, got started slow. Maybe Bud just caught him, so we know that he had a better round, but do we know for sure that he's the better fighter? And I think when you look at this fight across 9 rounds, the 3 knockdowns, the stoppage, Bud looked like he wasn't even in a fight when he walked out, and Terrence looked like he got smashed with a shovel. There's no way to watch that fight and not walk away saying Bud Crawford is levels above Errol Spence, and I don't think anybody thought that going in. I think it was one of the most dominant performances I've ever seen in a high-level championship boxing match, and I think it establishes just that Bud might be not an elite fighter, but a generational fighter. And he needed the right dance partner for him to be able to show that. And I think Errol Spence was that dance partner.
There's no question. I think you worded it absolutely in a perfect way because, again, you and I were sitting here during that last break, scratching our heads, trying to figure out the last time a fight had been so misread. I brought up Mayweather-Pacquiao and the idea of actual boxing pundits weren't picking Pacquiao to win that fight. I mean, you just go back down the line of the biggest fights we have had, and Canelo Triple G. I don't think a ton of pundits were picking Triple G to win that fight. A lot of people were taking Spence to win this fight, and it was as lopsided as it could get. I had 2 out of the first 3 rounds going to Spence, but it just didn't seem sustainable. Crawford was just collecting data, and by the time we got to round 4, 5, 6, it was already over. Round 7 was somewhat sad, and Crawford, pound for pound, number 1. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Now, Larry, with that being said, we'll talk UFC 291, because that's all anyone in the state of Utah wants to talk about right now. Terrific main event, terrific card front to back. In the end, Justin Gaethje, who was the underdog, knocks out Dustin Poirier in the second round with a head kick. What a tremendous finale to what was overall just a great pay-per-view card.
Yeah, it really was a fantastic card. I think they should go to Utah more often. Maybe that altitude is bringing out the best in some of these performances. And listen, Gaethje looked great. Poirier looked great. You know, the first round, I thought Poirier had the advantage. I thought he won the round, but not dominant, but won the round. And then Justin comes out in the second round, head kicks him, and puts him out. And you know, I did pick Justin. I'm not doing the Monday morning quarterbacking. You had asked me, so you know.
Yep.
And I was really in the minority. Right? Like, everything I was reading was Dustin. Dustin beat him 5 years ago. They've both improved about the same, and I completely disagree with that. I think that Dustin is largely the same fighter he was 5 years ago. He was a great fighter 5 years ago. He was a great striker 5 years ago with subpar wrestling and high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. and a great gas tank. And I think that's exactly how you would describe him today. And when you go back to that fight from 5 years ago, you say, well, yes, Dustin knocked him out in the 4th round. Was he dominating him before that? No, it was back and forth. They both hurt each other throughout that fight. And that's why it was, for many people, a fight of the year candidate, right? So you go back and you go, okay, so 5 years ago they fought. It was kind of neck and neck. Dustin wins, knocks him out in the 4th. Props to him. Dustin hasn't changed a whole lot since then. But what about Justin? Well, Justin's a completely different fighter than the fighter who fought Dustin Poirier 5 years ago. And where he's different is that when he fought Poirier, which was not long after he came into the UFC, he had a stated goal to be the most exciting fighter in the UFC. Not to be the best, not to be the most winning, but to be the most exciting. And what that meant to him was, I'll take as much damage as I have to give more, and we'll keep swinging and banging until one of us falls down, and it'll be exciting as hell, and I'll win some and I'll lose some, but I'm more focused on being exciting than I am on securing victories. And to his credit, and the credit to his coach, Trevor Whitman, after the Dustin Poirier fight, they retooled Justin and turned him into a different fighter who is actually extremely defensively sound, much more technical in his striking as opposed to winging big knockout punches. And you especially saw that in the Rafael Fiziev fight and the Michael Chandler fight. And especially Fiziev, because Fiziev is maybe the best striker at 155, or we thought he was. And Justin went in and figured him out after the first round and technically outstruck him and destroyed him across rounds 2 and 3. So you now have a Justin Gaethje who, instead of going in and swinging and banging and trying to be exciting, he's actually going in with a game plan to win, being more disciplined, choosing his shots, setting things up, and being more technical. And that's a different fighter. And that's the fighter who beat Dustin Poirier on Saturday night at UFC 291.
Again, our guest right now, Larry Pepe, as we recap UFC 291. Again, Justin Gaethje taking home the title against Dustin Poirier. You know, watching the post-fight conferences, Larry, from Saturday night, I loved both of the interviews with these two guys. One in particular, though, Justin Gaethje's response to the idea of Conor McGregor being next. To me, it's one of the most played-out storylines of the UFC. The sport simply does not need Conor McGregor, and Justin Gaethje was quick to basically say the same thing. He hasn't thought about it. Maybe it would be fun, but he also threw out a little dig saying, I don't fight fighters on steroids. I'm paraphrasing. He said something to that extent. Nonetheless, I loved his response to the idea of a fight with McGregor, and is one of the things that bugs me after every one of these events. McGregor, in my mind, is completely irrelevant to the sport right now, and I'm curious as to your thoughts.
So two thoughts. One, the part of Justin's response that I actually got a kick out of was when he said something to the effect of, "Oh, you have to lose to fight that guy anyway." Right, because he's fighting Michael Chandler, or he's supposed to. So I thought that was a good dig. Is Conor irrelevant? No, because he's still the biggest draw in MMA. So he's not irrelevant to the sport. He still brings more eyeballs than any other MMA fighter. But I would say he's irrelevant to the title picture at 155. Like, that's where I agree with you. Conor will always sell massive pay-per-views, unless he just can't win another fight. And then at some point, the shine comes off the apple. And I think it's starting to happen. I think the thirst for Conor is significantly lower after the 2 Poirier losses than it was before, because ultimately, if you're a fighter and you can't win a fight, no matter how great you can talk or no matter who you used to be, people start to lose interest. But where I agree he's irrelevant is to the title picture at 155 pounds. Like I've said for a very long time, as you know, when he was at 145, he was the best featherweight of all time. Now, I think the best Conor loses to the best Alexander Volkanovski, but we're years later. So when he had his reign at 45 and fighting it, he was the best in the world, bar none. But when he moved up to 155, the record shows he's a marginal, average 155-pound fighter. And when he fights the elite of the division, which Michael Chandler is not, by the way, but when he fights the elite of the division, he doesn't fare well. And I don't think he would fare well against the current elite of the division. Islam Makhachev, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, who now beat him twice soundly, Justin Gaethje, Beneil Dariush. Like, go down the line. Like, Conor would have a very difficult time being competitive with the elite at 155. So, yes, he's irrelevant to the title picture, but not to the sport and the sport's interest when he fights.
Larry, let's move on and talk about some of the other results. One that was somewhat sad for me, but the writing was on the wall, was Bobby Green defeating Tony Ferguson. I don't know what it is about Ferguson. I absolutely love it when this guy steps into the cage. But we have seen really an incredible downward spiral over his last 5-6 fights, and this was kind of the icing on the cake as Bobby Green picks up the third-round submission.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Ferguson, at one time, longest winning streak in UFC history in the lightweight division. Lightweight division, long recognized as the most competitive division in the UFC. And he was on a collision course with Khabib. I think Khabib would have destroyed him, but they were on a collision course, got booked several times to fight. The fight never came off. And now you look, he goes from winning, I believe it was 12 in a row, to now losing 6 straight. And he's had moments in those fights, but for the most part, I think what I'm starting to see is a fighter who can't keep up with the fighters currently, who I don't think Bobby Green is elite at 155, but he's underrated and very, very good. And he couldn't keep up with him. You could see the mismatch in speed. I mean, credit to Tony. He's a warrior. He kept coming forward. He kept, trying to engage. He certainly wasn't quitting in there in any way. But he just doesn't have the skill set and speed anymore to compete, I think, with the better fighters in the division. And one of the problems we have is that when a fighter has a name like Tony Ferguson, you're not going to be running to book him against a fighter who just won on the Contender Series and is having his first UFC fight, right? Like, you have to put Tony in with at least recognizable, established fighters. And he's just not doing well in any of those circumstances. And Bobby Green was a step down from a bunch of his prior opponents that he lost to, like Oliveira, for example, like Justin Gaethje. And it's still, when you really look at it, outside of that one punch in the first round where he knocks Green down and then Green recovers and basically wins the rest of the round, it was a mismatch. So you would hope for his health, for his safety, for his family, that he comes to a point where he steps away and doesn't continue to take damage. But he's already released a statement that he's not stepping away, that he criticized Bobby Green because he got poked in the eye and that he felt that Bobby knew the fight was going his way, meaning Tony's way, and that's why he poked him, and he still has a lot left in the tank, etc. And this is where you would hope that people around him would take him aside and say, hey, how much more damage do we want to take here? You've had a long career. You were an interim champion. You've had a great career. And hey, it's 6 straight, and that's not a fluke.
Larry, outside of the fights that we have talked about, what was your favorite on the card?
My favorite fight on the card. Well, outside of the ones we spoke about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, outside of the 2 we've talked on, yep.
Okay, I'll tell you a guy who absolutely impressed me. So the favorite kind of like fun, puts a smile on your face was the Derek Lewis fight, right? I mean, he comes out and Derek Lewis lands a switch flying knee 3 seconds into the fight, puts De Lima down, and then swarms him and gets the finish and, takes his shorts off and is waving him around and, doing the Derek Lewis thing. And Derek came in as a relatively good-sized underdog, which I thought was crazy only because De Lima's not a world beater. And Derek always has that fight-ending power in the heavyweights. You just never know. So props to the people who bet Derek Lewis and cashed that plus money ticket. And then what I thought was significant was he came out and said it was the last fight on his contract, which I had not realized. Now, if Derek Lewis is smart and his management is smart, they're on the phone with the PFL this morning, the Professional Fighters League, and they're securing a $2 million payday for him against Francis Ngannou. Because Ngannou needs an opponent in PFL. Ngannou is going to get rumors upwards of $8-9 million for that fight. And he has written into the contracts with PFL that whoever his opponent is has to get $2 million. That's a big payday.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of non-UFC fighters who could justify and get eyeballs for a fight with Francis Ngannou. Derek is that fighter. And if he's now a free agent, he could not be a free agent at a better time to secure that payday. So I think it was a big performance because if he lost and then he goes to the PFL and fights Ngannou, he's a guy who's lost a bunch of fights in a row. He looks like a guy who doesn't have it anymore. And it's a harder fight to market, right? It's a harder fight to push. Now he goes in off a stellar knockout. He goes in as the record holder for knockouts in UFC history. He sits alone atop that mountain. And that's a fight that I think you could market pretty easily. The downside is Derek's already come out and said that he hopes to re-sign with the UFC. So we'll see if the business prevails over liking being with the UFC. But if I were managing Derek Lewis, I'd be doing everything I could to get him to the PFL today.
Larry Pepe, again, our guest right now as we recap UFC 291. Second time in 11 months it's been in the state of Utah. Sellout crowd. Great performance. We've had great coverage on that card as well. You can follow us on YouTube at Drive Time Sports or visit CastleCountryRadio.com for all of the coverage on demand. Larry, before I let you go, I do want to get your thoughts on UFC 292, which is not too far off. We'll fast forward to August 19th. It's going to be back at the TD Garden in Boston. The main event right now shaping up for Sterling versus O'Malley. I don't know how much you've actually dug into this card, but your initial thoughts as we're still a few weeks away.
Yeah, I haven't dug into it a lot, but I'm very familiar with both fighters, and I think Aljamain is very underrated as a champion, right? And look, I thought he clearly lost the first non-fight when he got illegally kneed. Jan was clearly going to win the fight, and then that gives him the belt. And then to his credit, I thought in the rematch that he would not be competitive because I didn't think he was competitive in the first fight, and he was coming off a 13-month layoff, neck surgery, and so on. And it was a razor-thin fight, like a lot of people, it was. Some people gave it to Jan. Most people gave it to Aljamain. I gave it to Aljamain. I thought he looked great. I thought he won 3-2. And then you look at his performance against Henry Cejudo. That's another very close fight, controversial. I actually thought Henry edged him out in that fight. But he's underrated for as good as he is at what he does. And he's got unorthodox striking. He's very big and long for the weight class. But his grappling, his jiu-jitsu, his ability to dominate on the ground and really backpack you and not let you get back up, that's a long night for Sean O'Malley if O'Malley gets taken down because I believe he'll get dominated on the ground. Now, O'Malley's ground is better than we thought it was because when he was underneath Petr Yan, he was able to survive and he was able to get back up a couple of times. So we'll give him that. But on the feet, O'Malley is a sniper with incredible power at 135 pounds. and that could spell trouble for Aljamain. But ultimately, I think Aljamain's grappling gets the job done. Because when it's grappler versus striker, yes, the fight starts on the feet, but if you can't defend those takedowns, unless you get that knockout, you're in for a long night. I think that's what's going to happen at UFC 292.
He's Larry Pepe, always kind enough to join us. Larry, look forward to conversations again in the future as we get a little closer to 292. Would love to get you back on. As always, before I let you go, let us know where we can find more of your work, your commentary.
Oh, I think the simplest thing to do is you can go to YouTube and you can search MMA Truth Uncensored. That's me. Or you can search Larry Pepe. Or you can just go to peperadio.com. And you can sign up for my email list, and I'll let you know when new things are coming out.
Always a blast. I appreciate the time, Larry. Enjoy the rest of the week, and we'll catch up again real soon.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it as well.
We're going to pause for just a moment. We'll put the final touches on this edition of Drive Time Sports when we return. We are live from the Sutherland Studios on 107.3 FM and 750 AM.